He didn't just take my server, he stole its soul. Now, the corporate titan has no choice but to face the consequences. But the theft was just the beginning. Watch what happens when you mess with my custom hardware. The quiet hum of my machine was always the sound of competence. It was the low, steady vibration that told me everything was running perfectly. The cooling fans kicking in just right, the hard drives spinning with a familiar, comforting whir, the soft, rhythmic click of my mechanical keyboard under my fingertips. That machine, a tower I'd painstakingly built over 3 years, was more than just a collection of silicon and wiring. It was my office, my creative sanctuary, my personal Godam fortress against the chaos of corporate life. It was mine. It was a dark gray behemoth, sleek and understated, sitting on a minimalist wooden desk in the corner of my small, rented apartment. It housed my best work, the client databases, the proprietary algorithms, the chaotic drafts of my novel, and the entire repository of my sanity. And crucially, it housed the customized, triple redundancy RAID array that allowed me to access the main server farm of Omni Corp, where I spent 60 hours a week making the company's multi-million-dollar operations run without stuttering. The relationship between me and Mr. Thorne, my boss, was always complicated. It wasn't outright hostile, not initially. It was the kind of relationship built on a thin veneer of professional respect that felt perpetually ready to crack under the slightest pressure. He was a man who believed that personal ownership was an unnecessary, almost sentimental distraction. Everything in Thorne's worldview belonged to the company, and the company was him. The first crack appeared subtly, wrapped in the language of corporate expediency. "Listen, Alex," he'd said one Tuesday, leaning over my cubicle wall, smelling faintly of stale coffee and expensive cologne. "This thing you're using, it's running critical proprietary code, right? Seems a bit personal for a work unit. I'm going to have IT take a look and perhaps integrate it into the company network properly." I had bristled, the familiar surge of defensiveness rising in my throat. "It is integrated, Mr. Thorne. It's running the OmniCorp framework. But it was built by me for my use. It's my rig, sir." He'd waved a dismissive hand. "Details, Alex, details. It's an asset, and assets belong to the entity that owns the intellectual property. We'll just label it Project Alpha Test Station. It'll be on the corporate ledger." I swallowed the retort, the one that would have been sharp, perfectly articulated, and utterly infuriating. It was built with my sweat, my time, and my late-night existential dread, Mr. Thorne, and it deserves more than a bureaucratic label. The integration, it turned out, was invasive. It wasn't a simple plug-in. It was a full-scale transplant. They didn't just connect it, they seized it. They pulled the heavy tower out of my corner, the familiar weight of it scraping against the polished floor, and wheeled it into the sterile, brightly lit cavern of the IT department. That was the first humiliation, the physical removal, the erasure of my immediate, tactile connection to my competence. The next phase was the stripping down. I was ushered into a small monitoring room where a technician, a young man named Kevin, who had the weary look of someone who had seen too many beige boxes die a slow, pathetic death, stood beside my tower. "We're migrating the core architecture to the central rack, sir," Thorne explained, sipping from a disposable cup of lukewarm coffee, looking entirely too pleased with himself. "But we need the housing, the casing, the specific cooling fans, the high-speed interconnects to maintain latency. We're essentially loaning the hardware to the company." "Loaned," I repeated, the word feeling hollow, insufficient. It was not a loan. It was a theft, thinly disguised by jargon. Kevin began the process, opening the side panel like a surgeon opening a patient for an invasive procedure. He disconnected the RAID controller, carefully unplugged the massive power supply, and began gently, almost reverently, lifting the components out. "Where are you putting my SSDs?" I asked, suddenly desperate. "Into a standardized company chassis. They'll be accessible via the main switch. Don't worry, the data is safe." "Safe?" I scoffed. "They're mine. They are my definition of safe." The feeling that washed over me then was a cold, deep wave of betrayal. It wasn't just that the hardware was being moved from my desk to the company cage. It was that they were taking the essence of my machine, the specific, finely tuned components that made it perform at its peak, and subsuming it into their monolithic, impersonal system. It was like taking a masterpiece painting and mounting it onto a generic IKEA frame. It was cheaper, easier, and vastly inferior. The worst part, Thorne watched it all. He didn't interrupt, didn't offer a sympathetic nod. He watched with the proprietary smirk of a man who had successfully dictated the terms of a poorly written contract. He was enjoying my powerlessness. The subsequent days were purgatory. My machine, now designated OmniCorp Alpha 1, sat in the server room. A glorious, stolen ghost. I could log in remotely, of course. I could see the health metrics, the utilization graphs, the perfect green status bars that told me, yes, you are still here. You are still functioning, but you are no longer truly yours. But it wasn't the monitoring that killed me. It was the indignity of the new setup. The custom RGB lighting I'd meticulously configured, a moody, deep electric blue that made the entire tower glow with professional gravitas, had been replaced with the standard corporate white LED, which looked sterile, institutional, and utterly joyless. The fans, while still efficient, were now running under a standardized, slightly too loud corporate profile, a constant, droning reminder that my silent competence now served their loud, bureaucratic needs. I started fighting them. "Mr. Thorne, the cooling profile on Alpha 1 is causing unnecessary thermal spikes during peak load. The custom curve I designed reduces idle power draw by 12%. Nonsense, Alex. The standardized curve is optimized for enterprise throughput. It's sufficient. But sufficient isn't optimal. It's a compromise. It's like using a decent sedan when you own an F-250. He would just lean back in his ergonomic chair, his face impassive, a faint hint of amusement playing around his mouth. "You are confusing personal preference with measurable performance, Alex. It's a charming delusion, but ultimately data." The escalation intensified. The hardware wasn't just being used, it was being weaponized. My rig, the jewel of my personal skill, was being leveraged to run a complex, cross-platform deployment of a marketing campaign that was, frankly, completely beneath my pay grade. It was running the company's digital equivalent of a mediocre buffet dinner, while my machine was capable of cooking a Michelin star 5-course meal. And then came the final, crushing blow. A Friday afternoon, I was running diagnostics, watching the thermal load climb beautifully under the bespoke cooling profile, the one that was now, officially, the profile. I saw a notification pop up from the system administrator, Kevin, who was clearly enjoying his moment of power. The name of the profile had been changed. It was no longer Alpha 1 standard, nor was it Alex's optimal curve. It was renamed, in a single, petty, triumphant keystroke, to Thorne's glorious optimization, the digital equivalent of a mic drop. The blue light of the tower seemed to wink at me. The sound of the fans, while still efficient, now sounded like a mocking, sustained chuckle. The realization hit me with the force of a physical impact. They hadn't just taken the hardware, they hadn't just repurposed the data. They had taken the ownership, the soul, the identity of the machine, and stamped it with their own smug, corporate signature. This was it? The moment the simmering rage boiled over from a low, resentful simmer into a full, volcanic eruption. The injustice wasn't just that they stole it. The injustice was that they took something deeply personal, something that reflected my unique contribution and dedication, and replaced it with something standardized, bland, and utterly self-aggrandizing. They had treated my bespoke machine like a disposable plastic widget, even though it was a meticulously engineered piece of performance art. The decision wasn't instantaneous, but it was swift. It settled in my gut, cold, clear, and utterly final. I stopped fighting them on the semantic level. The battle over optimal versus sufficient was pointless. They wouldn't yield. They had already won the legal, bureaucratic war. So I would wage a war on the physical, functional level. I closed my terminal window, took a deep breath, and my fingers, surprisingly steady despite the tremor running through them, flew across the keyboard. I bypassed the standard administrative console, diving directly into the low-level command line interface, the place where the real power resided, where the machine spoke its purest language. I didn't initiate a shutdown. A shutdown is cooperative. A shutdown is a polite request. Thorne would just look smug and say, "See, it's still running, Alex, perfectly." No. I initiated a brick. It wasn't a simple, clean, graceful brick. That would be too merciful. I targeted the RAID controller first. The heart of the system. The thing that managed the perfect dance of data replication. I didn't just tell it to soft fail, I told it to aggressively fail. I forced a simultaneous, corrupting read/write loop across all 6 drives, overloading the cache memory with junk data, causing the parity checks to spiral into a catastrophic, irreversible failure. The system immediately threw a cascade of red alerts. Next, the BIOS. This was the machine's foundational DNA. I located the firmware partition and began a rapid, multiple-pass write operation. But instead of the verified, clean binary they had installed, I fed it a deliberately convoluted, malicious payload. A loop of code designed not just to crash the boot sequence, but to overwrite the crucial bootloader pointers with randomized, conflicting addresses. The server room monitors flickered. The green lines of life began to stutter, turn a sickly yellow, and then, with a sickening rush of data errors, flash a deep, angry crimson. But the crowning glory, the final, devastating insult, was reserved for the power supply and the customized cooling system. I accessed the fan control protocols and initiated a sequence that was designed to confuse the thermal management unit into a state of panicked hyper-awareness. The fans, which had been cheerfully humming their optimized tune, suddenly kicked into an impossible, deafening overdrive. They began to scream, a high-pitched, mechanical shriek that echoed through the sterile room. A sound of pure digital agony. Then I hit the final master command, initiate hard lock semi-permanent. The machine didn't just shut down, it convulsed. The internal lights didn't just turn off, they died. The beautiful, custom RGB glow didn't fade, it snapped out like a severed wire. The whirring of the drives didn't slow down, it hitched, stuttered, and then ground to a painful, metallic halt. The screaming fans, unable to resolve the impossible thermal loop, pitched higher and higher until they finally, utterly gave up. Silence. A profound, absolute, dead silence. The corporate tower, Omnicorp Alpha 1, lay frozen. A perfect, pristine monument to bureaucratic arrogance, now rendered useless. A titanium and silicon tombstone. I leaned back in my chair, the cool plastic against my spine feeling grounding, solid. The rage, which had been a hot, frantic energy in my chest, didn't vanish. It didn't dissipate. It solidified. It settled into a heavy, quiet satisfaction, a deep, resonant hum of righteous fury. A minute later, the doors to the server room slid open. Mr. Thorne walked in, followed by Kevin, who looked utterly defeated. his hand hovering over the emergency power button, like a supplicant. Thorne scanned the silent, glowing shell of my machine, his perfectly smooth expression cracking around the edges. He looked at the dashboard, where the system health icons were frozen on a collective, horrified red. He looked at the screaming fans, now emitting only a strained, high-pitched whine. He looked at the inert, dark casing that once glowed with my bespoke electric blue light. He finally looked at me, and the thin veneer of corporate condescension was gone. It was replaced by a stark, bewildered fury. "What did you do, Alex?" he demanded, his voice low and dangerous. I didn't rise from my chair. I didn't even gesture wildly. I just looked at the machine, at the silent, magnificent corpse of my hardware, and spoke the words that came out, clear and utterly calm. "I reminded you," I said, "that it was mine.